This chapter is going to be on federalism. And federalism, as we just discussed in the last lecture, is the mixed system of federal government and state and local government, allowing certain powers to be handled by the federal government and certain powers to be handled by the local government, as well as some powers handled by both and some powers not so clear. So we'll talk about those. There are a lot of issues that are affected by federalism, such as marijuana laws, same-sex marriage laws, the right to abortion. Even if we think about the future of self-driving cars, if we pass laws on state levels but not on the federal level, we could have self-driving cars driving across the border into other states. So some things eventually need to be handled on the federal level, and states' rights advocates will say that states want to be able to have that control on the state level. But let's just take a look. First, what we're going to talk about, what federalism is, the strengths of federal and state government, how it works, how it has evolved, and some of the conflicts. So one conflict that comes up in your book, they talk about sanctuary cities. And although I give you a lot of videos to watch on your own, there's some that I think I really would like you to watch so we can watch it together. And that would be this short video on sanctuary cities, just for all of us to kind of get an idea of what we're talking about.
When we think about sanctuary cities, we tend to imagine, depending on our political view, either lawless cesspools where federal law is utterly ignored.
Pretty much the definition of anarchy.
Human sacrifices, rapes, murders.
Satan worshippers. American lives are being lost.
They are breaking the law. They are harboring fugitives. This is absolutely nuts.
Or havens for one of the nation's most marginalized groups.
You are safe in Chicago.
This is about human beings, families.
And we will continue to be a place of refuge.
But in reality, neither of those descriptions quite fit. And to understand why, you have to put yourself in the shoes of a local police officer. First, what are sanctuary cities? They're cities and counties in the U.S. that limit their cooperation with immigration enforcement, which falls under federal jurisdiction. These policies are different in different places. In Chicago, it means city employees aren't supposed to share residence immigration status with other people. In Washington, D.C., it means police officers are barred from asking residents about their immigration status. But often, it comes down to this. How does a local police officer handle an unauthorized immigrant that he's already arrested for some other reason? Let's say a cop pulls someone over for speeding. The cop notices this person has an unpaid speeding ticket, and they miss their day in court. So the cop arrests the person, books them into the local jail. While they wait for someone to post bail, the person gets fingerprinted. That's part of the booking process. Those fingerprints then get sent to an FBI database, and then a database kept by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. That step is mandatory. Whether or not a city calls itself a sanctuary city, it still has to send those fingerprints through the FBI database. If the fingerprints match up with someone who ICE knows is an unauthorized immigrant, they might send the local cops holding this person something called a detainer request. The detainer request is just that. It's a request. The federal government is asking, not demanding, that police hold that person for an extra 48 hours after they would normally be released. That gives ICE time to come by, pick them up, start the deportation process. Now, ICE can't force local law enforcement to hold someone just by sending one of these detainer requests. The Constitution's 10th Amendment prohibits state governments from having to enforce federal law, and some federal courts have decided that detainer requests fall into that category. So, if you're a local police chief or sheriff and you get one of these requests, you have a choice. Do you honor the request, or do you let the person go? Let's say you honor the request, keep the person in jail for an extra 48 hours. ICE comes to pick them up, and they get deported. Word gets out around the immigrant community. Any time you interact with local police, it could mean deportation. Eventually, immigrants will be afraid to call the police, even when they're the victims of crime or the witnesses to it. And then, immigrants become easy targets.
Because the bad guys know that many immigrants will not call the police.
For a local police chief, this is a big problem. It's impossible to do their jobs when they don't have people's trust.
500,000 Angelinos, people that live in Los Angeles, are undocumented immigrants. I need their cooperation. I need them to work with their local police stations. I need them to be witnesses to violent crime.
What about the other option? What happens if you ignore the order and let this person go home? First, there's no guarantee that they won't get deported anyway. Whether a city considers itself a sanctuary or not, local law enforcement can't stop ICE from deporting someone. But there's another problem. Think of the levels of government like rungs on a ladder. You have the federal government at the top level, that includes agencies like ICE. You have the state government, governors, legislatures in the middle. And then at the bottom you have local government, mayors, police chiefs, sheriffs. If the federal government issues a detainer request and the local police department refuses to accept it, the state government can step in by taking away one of the state funding streams from the local police. That's what happened in Texas in 2017.
The governor of the great state of Texas, Greg Abbott, has declared he will sign a law banning sanctuary cities. He's already issued an order that cuts funding to those sanctuary cities.
This is dangerous, and I will not allow it as governor of Texas.
This map shows the counties in red that always cooperate with ICE and the ones that don't. Those are in orange, yellow, and green. The green counties have the most restrictions on when they cooperate with ICE detainer requests. In late January 2017, shortly after he got into office, President Donald Trump signed an executive order that opens the door to withholding federal funds from sanctuary cities or counties. The wording of that order is vague, and it's already being challenged in federal court. But if Trump's plan does move forward, it could put local law enforcement officers across the country in a lose-lose situation. For them, deciding whether to honor a detainer request is often about choosing between financial security on one hand and public safety on the other.
Okay, so that's just one example of where federalism comes into conflict with between state and federal laws. This is just, your book shows some data about labor force participation of men between ages 25 and 55. It just shows the decline, the steady decline. And there is data that in the Bureau of Labor Statistics that believe that it doesn't have, let's see if we can say, experts from across political spectrum believe there is no relationship between immigration and the flight from work among white men. So you can look in your book and get more of the details. But oftentimes, fear of foreigners is based on the fact that they might take jobs. That is actually mentioned in the first video, which I didn't play for you. So you can take a look at that. So forging ahead with federalism, the other two options besides federalism that the Founding Fathers had would be to be a unitary government, would mean that the colonies or the states would lose all of their control and that the entire power of the government would be at the federal level in one unitary government. This was most common in during the colonial times, and many nations have this kind of central government. Japan does, France does. So where the central government has all of the authority. Then there is the Confederation, which is kind of what the United States attempted to do with the Articles of Confederation, and that's where the power is mainly in the states, but they came across so many problems. They had a weak central authority. They weren't able to build up a common defense or any economic benefits. So that didn't work for them. So what the Founding Fathers came up with the Constitution was what we know as federalism. This federal system. Power divided between national and state governments. The conflict is built right into the system, and the United States has many layers, making it much more difficult. So it's a very complicated situation, still allowing for different levels of government to have different powers. If you look at the stats of the trust in government, most people trust their local government more than their state, and their state government more than their federal government. Usually, the idea is that the closer you are to your government, many of you can go and maybe even walk into the office of your Henderson mayor or the Las Vegas mayor, and maybe you can um, see your state assembly person or your state senator at various events around town. You could probably even find their address, go to their house. I often call them up, especially when they're running for office. It's a little harder to get connected with your federal government representatives. It's harder. You can still call their offices, but you'll probably get a staff member. During the elections, I often call the people who are running for office, and they pick up their phones because Nevada state legislatures don't make a lot of money, so they don't usually have large staff and offices. So, you have a closer connection to the people that are closer to you. Therefore, people have trust in government when it's closer to them. So there are advantages to state level policy and advantages to national policy. So when states make laws, they're usually more responsive to their citizens' needs and desires. For example, Nevada wanted to legalize marijuana. Through initiatives, we were able to pass the legalization of marijuana. Majority of the people wanted it. And states usually offer more protection, and they offer more innovation. So it's much harder to come up with a whole program, say, for self-driving cars all over the United States on the federal level. Sometimes states are a lot more innovative, and they can put together all of the, or let's say marijuana. Colorado is a state that many other states will now follow because of their innovation of their banking programs and their the way they've set up their marijuana sales institution. And so this gives people a lot more choices. If you like certain aspects of a certain state, you can move there and live there. If you don't like your own state, you can move to another state. Um, Advantages of national policy, however, are that not usually, but when something is made, it seems to be more fair because it's going to be the same policy for all 50 states. If we have certain resources like tax revenue that we pull in and we share amongst the state, maybe according to population, resources get shared across the state. And also, say, for example, education, it's easier to standardize best practices all around the United States when something is done on the federal level. But oftentimes, what happens is that states will pass a law, put together a solution for certain issues, whether it's legalizing marijuana or a certain type of education program, and then other states will copy it and becomes popular, and then the national government will adapt that process. So sometimes, many times, it starts at the state level and then goes to the national level. Let's see. This shows the different between states' healthcare spending per capita. So per person, the light green is the state that spends the least amount on healthcare per person, and the orange states spend the most amount. So, how federalism works, we can go back to what we just discussed in the last section, the articles granted in Article 1, Section 8. These are called the enumerated powers or expressed powers. So you should know these words. These are powers that are actually spelt out. I like to remember enumerated, the word number is in there, listed out. So 19 federal government powers are granted to the Congress to pay debts, raise the army, punish pirates. Let me see if I can find section 4, but let's go to section 1 first, and then I'll go back to 4. Article 1, Section 8. So the Congress shall have the power to lay taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, borrow money, regulate foreign commerce with foreign nations, establish a rule of naturalization, coin money, um, punish counterfeiting, establish post office to promote the progress of science and useful arts, blah, 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 punish pirates, declare war, raise an army, raise a navy. Yeah. So that's all in Article 1, Section 8. That's where the federal government gets their powers. And then there's also the Commerce Clause, which is also in Article 1, Section 8. Where are we to provide? Oh, maybe it's at the beginning of it. Right here. To regulate commerce with foreign nations, among the several states, and with the Indian tribes. So that's the Commerce Clause right here in Article 1, Section 8. And then also the Necessary and Proper Clause, which is we've already gone over, but just to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by the Constitution and the government of the United States. So the Necessary Proper Clause says Congress may make any laws that are necessary and proper to carry out. Constitutional Clause, the Commerce Clause says that anything between states the federal government needs to handle. And then there are some inherent powers. These are powers that are implied, but not specifically named. And then we have the Supremacy Clause, which is that the national government laws and treaties are the supreme law of the land. So when there is a conflict between state and federal government, the Supremacy Clause says that the national government rules. And then we also have what's called the reserved powers. So the Constitution guarantees in the 10th Amendment that states retain government authority that is not explicitly granted to the national government, such as education, public health, in-state commerce, and state elections. And this is, if we look at right here, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution. So, in other words, not in Article 1, Section 8, saying that Congress is supposed to do it, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So, in other words, Article 10 says that there are reserved powers that are reserved for the states if they're not guaranteed, if they're not explicit that it's the federal government's responsibility, or if it's not prohibited that the states aren't allowed to act on it. So many of these are, like I said, education, public health, elections, and in-state commerce. So you can look at these charts in your book. They talk about the opioid problem, and you can see that according to whatever state you're in, you may have different rules that affect that state. And until the federal government rules on an issue, all of these states will have different laws. Then, in federalism, the Constitution also authorizes for shared powers, and these are powers and duties that are shared jointly by the state and national government. We call them concurrent powers. I've put them here in bold, which means that you will be asked questions on the exam. This is when both national and state government have the power to do these items, such as raise taxes. Both national and state government can make taxes. They can both build roads, construct bridges, build railways, update their communication networks. They can both borrow money and they can both regulate business. Those are concurrent powers. And then again, we talked about this in the last section, but the full faith and credit clause, this requires each state to recognize and uphold laws passed by other states. This is in the Article 4 in the Constitution. Where are we here? Article 4. No, sorry, that can't be right. Did they trim them? Oh, okay. All right. Oh, this is saying Amendment 4. Okay, sorry. Let me find the right Article 4. Here we are. Full faith and credit shall be given in each state to the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state, and the Congress may be general laws prescribing the manner of acts. Okay, so this first one, full faith and credit, basically says that every state has to recognize the acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state. So this requires that states recognize and uphold these laws. So as far as concurrent powers, if you refer to your book, there's a chart there with the two circles intersecting, and in the middle are the concurrent powers. You should be familiar with this so you understand, generally speaking, what the powers of the national government, national meaning federal, the federal government is. They get to regulate trade between states and between other countries. They and only the federal government coins the money. They maintain the armed forces. They can declare war and establish post offices. These are specific to the federal government. The powers of the state government, which are reserved, that are not mentioned anywhere in the Constitution, are control public education, punish criminals, protect public health and safety, conduct elections, and establish their local governments. They're allowed to do this because these are under the 10th Amendment says if it's not specified, these are some of the powers that state governments do. And concurrent powers maintain law and order. Both levels of government do that. They both can levy taxes. They both can borrow money. They both can take land for public usage. Both levels of government can do that. And they both can provide for the public welfare and establish courts. So just be sure you understand what concurrent powers are. You should be able to answer a question on the exam for that. How federalism works. So your book breaks up federalism into two periods. I think they break it up into 5 now. It used to be 4, but now they have federalism today. So mainly I'd like you to be concerned with the first 2. This is early on, up until the Great Depression, we had what scientists call dual federalism. Political scientists call dual federalism. This is when state and national government had relatively clear responsibilities. The state government knew what they did, and the federal government knew what they did. And so your book uses the analogy of cakes. And for dual federalism, they use the analogy of the layer cake, which shows clearly defined division of governing authority between national and state. So the national government and the state government, they know what their roles are. Okay? So layer cake, levels of government fall into separate categories. National government's in charge of international relations. So no state governments would reach out to foreign countries during that time. And then things started to change during the Great Depression. And we have what we call cooperative federalism. This is from the New Deal on, when President Franklin Roosevelt, started making New Deal policies. This dual arrangement collapsed, and they did away with it. And the lines started to blur on the authority. So we call this the marble cake. This is when different government functions are all swirled together. So maybe federal funding will be given to the states, but they want the states to implement the policy, so they kind of start working together. So that's called the marble cake federalism, mingling governing authorities with functions overlapping across national and state government. So please read up on these 2 types, cooperative and dual federalism, and how they use this analogy of the layered and marble cake. After about the early 80s, we have what we call new federalism, where Reagan came in and tipped the pendulum of power away from national authorities and gave more authorities to the states by giving block grants, where the federal government would give dollars to states, say for building their highways, but they wouldn't give them any instructions of how to do it, and they would just use the money however they pleased. And then we had like progressive federalism. This is when state officials had considerable leeway in achieving their national programs, but the national government set programs goals. So this was more during the Obama era, the progressive federalism. So they still did these grants, but this time they said, okay, we're going to give you money for the highway. Let's use education. We're going to give you money towards your education in your state, but we want your goal to be to raise the amount of senior graduates in high school from, say, 50% to 70% within a 10-year period or something like that. So progressive federalism is when the national government sets program goals and relies on the states. You can do it however you want, but these are the goals we'd like you to meet. And then federalism today, your book says Trump trying to go back to the Reagan era where let the states do whatever they want, and fewer federal dollars and fewer federal regulations. So cut regulations from the federal level and also cut the money given from the federal level to the states to help with those areas. If you look at government spending as a proportion of GDP, compared to other nations, the United States spends about 35, maybe 38% of GDP. This might be an old chart, 2019. No, we're good. As we saw with taxes, other Scandinavian and European countries spend a lot more than the United States per GDP. So the issues of federalism, sometimes we get unfunded mandates, and these are when the federal government says, for example, okay, we're raising the speed limit of all interstate highways to, I don't know, 80 miles an hour. Every state has to raise it. That's a mandate, but if they don't give any money to the states, then the states have to come up with the funding for changing the signage, educating people, putting out PR statements so that everybody knows that the speed limit has changed. That would be an example of an unfunded mandate. States don't usually like that. We like to have funds for things that you're being told to do. The problems we face. So local governments face problems sometimes beyond their capacity. So if you look at endangered species or invasive species, they know no boundaries. So sometimes or air pollution. Some problems are way too big for local governments or state governments to handle and need to be handled on the federal level. But in a nutshell, the problem of federalism is that it's three-dimensional, that there are policy debates taking place in Washington as well as 50 state capitals as well as thousands of cities and counties. And so the different level of government all have different roles to play. Sometimes they're overlapping and sometimes they come in conflict with each other. And then federalism in the courts. Disputes about drawing a line where national power ends and state authority begins. So some state courts, many states elect their judges, so you may have judges that are more partisan than other judges. They may pass rulings, and then when those cases are appealed and go to the federal level, they may come up with different readings on it. So it kind of depends on which party is in charge and which party has more sway. Another explanation is that the courts have key players in allocating the power. In other words, they can make decisions that change anything that the government has done on both levels. Judges play a balancing role for federalism. So we'll often see a lot of conflicts in the laws that are made, both on the federal level and the state level, decided in the court system. Okay, and I'd like to end this. I'm not going to play this for you, but this is a John Oliver program. For those of you who know him, fine, please watch this. This gives you a lot of ideas of how federalism has problems on the marijuana issue, how there are federalistic problems and challenges between state and federal government. Just a warning, he does swear a lot, so if your ears are sensitive to the F word, you might not want to watch it. But it does kind of, I believe this episode helps reinforce the understanding of the challenges of federalism on this issue of marijuana. So please give it a look. And then your last slide today will be your exam notes. So please know and understand the following topics. Be familiar with Article 1, Section 8 in the Constitution that gives the powers of Congress. It also has the necessary and proper clause, the commerce clause, and then the full faith and credit clause is in Article 4. The reserved powers is mentioned in Amendment 10. And then concurrent powers, you have that lovely intersecting chart that will help you answer one of the exam questions for that. And then the types of federalism, be familiar with dual federalism and cooperative federalism as they relate to the two different cake analogies. Okay, and I haven't mentioned this, but if you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email. You will, and please be keeping up with your discussion questions. And if there's anything you'd like me to address, please send that to me in an email as well. All right, great. Talk to you next lecture.